As 1940 begins, Italy's fascist leader Benito Mussolini is incensed because the British control the nearby island of Malta. This outpost is over 1,000 miles from the nearest British bases at Gibraltar in the west and Alexandria in the east, but it is only 50 miles from Sicily. Malta gives England control of the Mediterranean, and in 1940, the British are at war with Italy's ally, the Germans. On June 11th, one day after Italy enters the war, Mussolini unleashes his bombers on Malta. One RAF pilot who is stationed in Malta is Tony Spooner.
The Italians used rather antiquated aircraft, and they weren't particularly well protected by armor, and they tended to turn tail at the first sign of any opposition. I was in Coastal Command, and our job in Malta was to go out at night and find the ships which were trying to transport supplies from Italy and Sicily to Rommel's forces in North Africa. Having found them, our job then was to home other people to come and attack them, and occasionally attack them ourselves. Well, the population took it very well, bearing in mind it wasn't even their war. As far as possible, the routine went on. It was business as usual to the extent that you could do business as usual. The bars kept open as long as they possibly could, but of course we eventually ran out of beer and everything else nearly. But it was pretty grim food. It was all tin food or whatever they could find.
While the Maltese go about their daily business, they learn to live with the constant air raids from the ineffective and ill-equipped Italian Air Force.
You get used to it like everything else. It's pretty frightening at first, but then you see other people are paying no attention to it, and in the end you start paying no attention to it.
The Maltese show no signs of giving in, and British anti-aircraft fire wears down Mussolini's pilots.
The Italian bombers have trouble hitting their target in the face of an anti-aircraft defense, which, while in its initial stages not all that formidable, is still more flocked than the Italians have ever faced before.
British submarines and seaplanes emerge around Malta and constantly torpedo Axis supply vessels on their way to North Africa. This activity is becoming a thorn in the side of the Germans and an embarrassment to the Italians. In January 1941, Hitler sends an entire German air fleet, which has been called back from the Russian front and moved to Sicily. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring is given control of 2,000 top-rate aircraft. Kesselring's mission is to gain control of the air and sea between South Italy and North Africa.
Each adversary had a slightly different reason for wanting this particular piece of rock. As the attacks go on, Malta becomes a symbol for both sides. It's been called the Mediterranean Verdun. The struggle for Malta took on an importance that had nothing to do with the actual utility of the island. In many ways, the German Air Forces that go after Malta are at the peak of their effectiveness. They've been operating in Europe and in the Mediterranean since the beginning of the war. The crews are well-trained, very experienced, and jumping high morale. And this is particularly true of the bomber wings, who have had it mostly their own way since coming to the Mediterranean. By December, you've got over 1,000 air raids mounted by aircraft which are fast enough and maneuverable enough to elude ground defenses and shake up ground fire. The German Dornier, Heinkel, and Junkers 88, they call them medium bombers, we call them light medium bombers, are fast, maneuverable, take punishment well. And so it becomes harder and harder to bring them down. And a Malta anti-aircraft defense that depends heavily on local volunteers is beginning to wonder, well, what's it take to get these guys?
December 1941. The 1,000 Axis raids on Malta has not brought the island any closer to a surrender. Only 15 miles long, Malta becomes the most heavily bombed target in the world.
This was a good way to go mad, particularly because, unlike the American system, the Germans did not allow for relieving crews and pilots after a certain number of missions. Psychologically, they're poorly equipped for the kind of war of attrition that increasingly, with nobody really liking the idea, becomes the norm over Malta.
On April 17, 1942, the embattled island of Malta wins a decoration for bravery. King George VI awards the island the Order of the George Cross. But the award ceremony is cut short by the arrival of yet another Axis bombing. In April 1942, the American carrier Wasp brings British Spitfires into the Mediterranean.
The only way of getting the fighters to Malta was to put them on board an aircraft carrier and get the aircraft carrier within about 500 miles of Malta and then fly them off the decks.
As soon as the Spitfires arrive, German radar alerts the Axis air fleet at Sicily. The Luftwaffe strikes and destroys or disables every one of the planes. On the same day, British intelligence learns that an airborne invasion from Sicily is imminent. Meanwhile, German and Italian troops on Sicily are preparing for the airborne invasion of Malta. Hitler and Mussolini agree on a date for the Axis assault, early June. By now, Malta has been under steady aerial siege for 23 months. The British no longer have airplanes and very little ammunition left.
We had a limited number of anti-aircraft guns, and to the extent possible, it was very hard to get supplies to Malta at all. They were rationed to only fire bombers, not fighters.
The one resource which keeps the casualty rate low is the island's excellent shelters. Since Malta is made of limestone, the caverns provide protection for the Maltese.
The rock is very soft, and there were a great number of shelters, and they made a great number more. The Maltese took it remarkably well. They took it just the way that the Londoners took it. And they just put up with every privation with a shrug of the shoulders and said, we'll carry on. But basically, the bombing turned the whole thing round. Any thought of giving in after they'd been bombed was the same as happened in London. Any thought of giving in after you're bombed, you don't give in. Bombing has a reverse effect.
In early May 1942, the USS Wasp and the British carrier Eagle return and successfully deliver a replacement squadron of 64 Spitfires within flying range of Malta.
But this time, we'd learned from the errors the first time. The first lot all landed at Takali, which is the fighter airfield, and they were very largely written off on the ground.
until German planes committed to Malta are required elsewhere. On the Russian front, in the Western Desert, they continue an increasingly futile pattern of bombing an island that most historians agree was not that important.
The rationing of supplies takes its toll as morale sinks. Community kitchens barely feed a fraction of the population.
I seem to remember the price of an egg. In those days, a black market egg was up to about 3 shillings, which was equivalent to about 10 pounds today or something.
The situation in Malta is becoming critical if supply ships are unable to break through the Axis obstacles. Unknown to the Maltese or the British forces on the island, the English government is unable to agree on whether to defend Malta or surrender.
The war cabinet was prepared to give up Malta, apart from Churchill. On paper, the island was completely undefendable. You can actually see Sicily on a fine day.
Building on Churchill's stubbornness, one final convoy carrying the last hope of relief for Malta leaves England. 14 merchant ships carrying over 120,000 tons of supplies are escorted by 4 aircraft carriers, 40 destroyers, 2 battleships, and 12 cruisers. But the reinforced convoy is too big to conceal from the Germans. August 10th, Malta's savior fleet enters the Mediterranean. Converging against it, a powerful German-Italian force, spearheaded by 21 submarines and 540 aircraft. On August 12th, the Axis air attack hits in full force. British carrier planes and concentrated ack-ack fire again keep the attackers away from the merchant ships. But finally, 40 Stuka bombers go into a power dive through the barrage. Five bombed merchant ships limp into the harbor at Malta. They bring food, but no gasoline. The tanker Ohio, an American ship with an all-British crew, carries the gasoline that's Malta's sole hope for survival. Heavily damaged, the slowly sinking tanker staggers into harbor with its precious cargo. Malta has survived its darkest hour. After the operations at Malta, Tony Spooner would be a flight instructor and later serve as a coastal command officer in the invasions on D-Day.